They don't attack you when you are weak. They attack you the moment they realize you no longer fear them. And the last trick they use is so subtle, most people never even notice it until it destroys their peace. A narcissist does not fear loud people. They do not fear angry people. They do not even fear powerful people in the traditional sense. What truly unsettles them is someone who has become emotionally independent, someone who no longer needs constant validation, approval, reassurance, or permission to feel worthy, because the narcissist survives through emotional dependence. Their sense of control is built on the invisible belief that your emotional stability must somehow depend on their opinion of you. The moment that connection weakens, the foundation beneath them begins to crack. At first, narcissists are often attracted to emotionally strong people without realizing it. They admire the confidence, kindness, intelligence, resilience, and emotional depth that these individuals carry. Strong people possess light, and narcissists are drawn toward light because internally they often feel empty, disconnected, and fragile. But admiration quickly transforms into discomfort once the narcissist understands something important. Emotionally strong people may love deeply, but they cannot be permanently controlled. That realization creates fear. Not fear in the ordinary sense. It is a deeper psychological panic. Because narcissists build relationships like kingdoms. They want emotional ownership. They want influence over how you feel about yourself. They want the power to reward you with affection or punish you with distance. And this system only works when the other person slowly abandons their inner stability. But emotionally strong people always return to themselves eventually. That is what makes them dangerous in the eyes of a narcissist. A strong person may cry, but they recover. They may feel pain, but they reflect. They may be disappointed, but they do not completely lose their identity in someone else's behavior. And this frustrates the narcissist beyond words because manipulation becomes ineffective when a person remains connected to their own truth. The narcissist expects emotional collapse. They expect endless chasing. They expect fear of abandonment to keep you obedient. But when you begin responding calmly instead of emotionally, something changes in the dynamic. Suddenly, their silence no longer terrifies you. Their criticism no longer defines you. Their emotional games stop producing the same reaction. And to the narcissist, this feels like losing oxygen. Many people believe narcissists want love above all else. In reality, what many of them crave most is emotional control. Love requires vulnerability, honesty, empathy, and mutual respect. Control only requires strategy. That is why emotionally mature people eventually become difficult for narcissists to tolerate. A mature person asks questions. They notice inconsistencies. They trust actions more than words. They begin setting boundaries without guilt. And boundaries are deeply threatening to narcissists because boundaries announce something they cannot accept. You no longer have unlimited access to me. The emotionally strong person slowly becomes unpredictable to the narcissist, not because they are manipulative, but because they stop reacting according to the narcissist's script. Instead of begging during emotional withdrawal, they create distance. Instead of defending themselves against false accusations, they remain calm. Instead of constantly proving their loyalty, they begin observing the unhealthy patterns unfolding before them. This quiet emotional clarity terrifies the narcissist more than confrontation ever could, because narcissists often rely on confusion to maintain power. Confused people are easier to control. Insecure people are easier to manipulate. Exhausted people stop trusting themselves. But emotionally strong individuals eventually regain clarity. They step back, they reflect, they connect the dots between affection and manipulation, between compliments and control, between love and emotional dependency. And once that awareness appears, the narcissist senses danger immediately. You will notice it in subtle ways. Their charm becomes less natural and more calculated. their criticism becomes sharper. Small disagreements suddenly become dramatic conflicts. They begin testing your boundaries more aggressively because they are trying to measure whether you are truly slipping away from their influence. What the narcissist fears most is not losing the relationship itself. What they truly fear is losing psychological authority over someone they once controlled emotionally. Because your emotional strength forces them to confront something they spent their entire lives avoiding, their own inner emptiness. Strong people unintentionally become mirrors. Without trying, they reflect emotional stability, self-respect, and authenticity back toward the narcissist. And that reflection can feel unbearable to someone who has spent years constructing a false identity built on superiority, attention, and emotional domination. That is why the stronger you become, the more unpredictable the narcissist's behavior often becomes. Your healing threatens the illusion they worked so hard to maintain. Your peace becomes proof that they are no longer the center of your emotional world. Your silence becomes evidence that their control is fading. And nothing unsettles a narcissist more deeply than realizing the person they once manipulated has finally stopped needing their permission to feel valuable. There is a silent moment in every toxic relationship that changes everything forever. Most people never notice when it happens. There are no dramatic announcements, no visible alarms, no clear warning signs flashing in the room. Yet, the narcissist feels it instantly. It is the moment they realize they are losing control over you emotionally. And from that point forward, their behavior often shifts in ways that feel confusing, cold, manipulative, or even cruel. What makes this moment so dangerous is that it rarely begins with conflict. In fact, it often begins with peace. You stop arguing over every accusation. You stop trying to explain your intentions repeatedly. You stop defending your character every time they twist your words. You stop chasing emotional closeness after every period of distance. And without realizing it, you begin reclaiming ownership of your emotional energy. The narcissist notices this long before you do. At first, they may test you subtly. They might ignore a message to see if panic appears. They may become emotionally distant to provoke anxiety. They may criticize something small just to watch whether insecurity still controls you. In the past, these tactics may have worked perfectly. Your emotional reactions reassured them that they still occupied the center of your psychological world. But healing begins the moment you stop organizing your entire emotional life around someone else's moods. And that is the hidden moment the narcissist recognizes. It can happen quietly during a simple conversation. Perhaps they insult you, expecting an emotional reaction, but you respond calmly. Perhaps they disappear emotionally for days, expecting you to beg for reassurance, but you continue living your life peacefully. Perhaps they provoke an argument hoping to destabilize you, but you no longer participate in the chaos. That is when panic begins rising beneath their carefully constructed mask, because narcissists often mistake emotional dependency for love. If your happiness depends entirely on their approval, they feel powerful. If your identity collapses during their absence, they feel important. If your emotional state can be controlled through praise or punishment, they feel secure. But emotional independence breaks this illusion completely. Suddenly, you become difficult to predict. The narcissist can no longer guarantee your reactions. Their old methods stop producing the same emotional results. And for someone who relies heavily on psychological control, this creates enormous internal frustration. Many people expect narcissists to react with sadness when losing control. In reality, they often react with increased manipulation. Why? Because your emotional freedom threatens the foundation of the relationship itself. Toxic control only survives when fear remains active. fear of abandonment, fear of rejection, fear of not being enough. The moment those fears begin disappearing, the narcissist senses their influence fading, and this realization wounds their ego deeply. Not because they truly lost ownership over you. No human being ever possesses another person emotionally, but because they believed they did. This is why narcissists often become more intense exactly when you become calmer. People are confused by this pattern. They think, I am finally becoming peaceful. Why are they becoming worse? The answer is simple. Your peace interrupts the cycle that once benefited them. Your emotional stability exposes the manipulation. When you no longer beg during silence, their silence loses power. When you no longer defend yourself endlessly, accusations lose power. When you stop seeking validation from them, criticism loses power. When you trust your own perception again, gaslighting begins to fail. And this creates a terrifying experience for the narcissist because they suddenly feel emotionally irrelevant in ways they cannot tolerate. That is why this hidden moment often marks the beginning of the narcissist's final psychological games. They sense that your emotional attachment is weakening. They feel your energy pulling away from their control, and instead of respecting your growth, they often intensify their tactics in desperate attempts to regain influence over your mind, emotions, and self-worth. When a narcissist begins to realize that their control is slipping away, they rarely react with honesty. They rarely sit down and say, I am afraid of losing influence over you. Instead, they reach for one final psychological strategy designed to pull you back into emotional confusion. This last dirty trick is often the most dangerous because it does not always appear cruel on the surface. In many cases, it appears soft, emotional, vulnerable, or even loving. That is exactly why so many people fail to recognize it until they are trapped inside the cycle again. The narcissist understands something very important about human emotions. People can survive anger more easily than emotional uncertainty. Direct cruelty may hurt, but confusion slowly destroys clarity. And when clarity disappears, manipulation becomes easier once again. So just when you begin emotionally detaching, just when you finally start healing, the narcissist changes their approach completely. Suddenly, they become kind again. The coldness disappears. The criticism softens. The distance turns into attention. The silence becomes affection. And for a moment, the person you originally fell in love with seems to return. This is the final trap. Many emotionally exhausted people mistake this temporary shift as proof of change. They think, maybe they finally understand my pain. But what often happens is much darker. The narcissist senses that fear no longer controls you, so they replace fear with hope, because hope is sometimes the strongest leash of all. They begin reminding you of beautiful memories. They bring back inside jokes, emotional moments, promises about the future, and small gestures that once made you feel deeply loved. They may apologize in ways that sound convincing. They may suddenly become attentive, affectionate, emotionally expressive, and vulnerable. Some even cry. Some speak about childhood wounds, abandonment, loneliness, or personal struggles. And because empathetic people naturally want to heal others, they lower their guard. But the narcissist is not necessarily reconnecting through genuine emotional accountability. They are often reconnecting through emotional survival. Your distance threatens their sense of control, validation, and importance, so they create emotional intensity to pull you back toward attachment. This is why the final dirty trick feels so psychologically confusing. It activates both pain and hope at the same time. One part of you remembers the manipulation. Another part remembers the love. One part wants freedom. Another part wants the beautiful version of the relationship you kept hoping would become permanent. And the narcissist carefully feeds that inner conflict. Sometimes they suddenly become the perfect partner for a short period of time. They listen better, they speak gently, they respect boundaries temporarily, they become emotionally available in ways you begged for months or even years to experience. And because human beings naturally crave emotional resolution, many people interpret this behavior as transformation. But true transformation requires consistency, humility, accountability, empathy, and sustained behavioral change over time. Temporary emotional performance is not healing. Intense affection after emotional withdrawal is not necessarily love. In toxic relationships, emotional extremes are often tools of control. The narcissist studies your emotional hunger carefully. They know exactly what you missed, what you longed for, what wounds still remain open inside you. And before losing access to you completely, they often deliver those things briefly, strategically, and intensely. This creates emotional addiction, because now your mind becomes trapped between two realities, the painful version of them and the loving version of them. You begin chasing the return of the affectionate version, believing that if you just love harder, stay patient longer, or understand them deeply enough, the good moments will finally become permanent. But the narcissist's final trick is not really about love. It is about reactivating emotional dependency before you fully escape their influence. In some cases, the trick becomes even more manipulative. They may suddenly act broken, helpless, depressed, or abandoned. They may tell you nobody understands them except you. They may imply that leaving them would destroy them emotionally. Some create guilt so powerful that the other person feels selfish for wanting peace. And compassionate people suffer deeply in this stage because empathy becomes weaponized against them. The narcissist understands that emotionally strong people cannot always be controlled through intimidation forever, but they can sometimes be controlled through compassion, nostalgia, guilt, hope, or emotional responsibility. That is why this final trick often feels softer than the earlier manipulation. The aggression may decrease, the cruelty may become less obvious, but underneath the surface, the goal often remains the same: regain emotional access before the connection disappears permanently. And this is the moment where many people lose themselves again, not because they are weak, but because the narcissist temporarily becomes everything they had begged them to be all along. Narcissists rarely control people through obvious force alone. Their most powerful weapons are often invisible emotions that slowly reshape the way another person thinks, reacts, and sees themselves. Among those weapons, guilt, silence, and confusion are especially destructive because they attack the mind quietly. They do not leave visible bruises, yet they can slowly erode confidence, emotional stability, and inner peace until a person no longer trusts their own instincts. At the beginning of the relationship, these tactics are subtle. The narcissist may appear sensitive, misunderstood, emotionally wounded, or deeply caring. They study your personality carefully. They learn what matters to you, what hurts you, what makes you feel responsible for others, and what kind of emotional pressure causes you to surrender your boundaries. Compassionate people are especially vulnerable because they naturally want harmony, understanding, and emotional connection. The narcissist quickly realizes this and begins using emotions not as a bridge toward intimacy, but as instruments of influence. Guilt becomes one of the first tools. The narcissist rarely says directly, "I want to control you." Instead, they create situations where you begin feeling responsible for their emotional state. If they become distant, you feel guilty for upsetting them. If they react with anger, you feel guilty for saying the wrong thing. If they withdraw affection, you begin examining your own behavior desperately, searching for mistakes that explain the sudden emotional coldness. Over time, guilt trains you to abandon yourself. You stop speaking honestly because you fear hurting them. You stop setting boundaries because you fear being called selfish. You stop expressing needs because you fear becoming difficult. And slowly, your emotional energy becomes organized around protecting the narcissist from discomfort. This psychological conditioning happens gradually. Most victims do not realize how deeply manipulated they have become because guilt feels morally convincing. Empathetic people naturally reflect on their behavior and ask themselves difficult questions. Narcissists exploit this self-awareness expertly, but guilt alone is not enough. Silence becomes the second weapon. Healthy silence can create peace, reflection, or emotional space. Narcissistic silence is different. It is often strategic. It is designed to create anxiety, uncertainty, and emotional imbalance. The narcissist suddenly becomes emotionally unavailable without explanation. Messages become cold. Conversations shrink into emptiness. Affection disappears. Warmth evaporates, and the victim begins spiraling internally. What did I do wrong? Why are they acting this way? Are they losing interest? Should I apologize? Should I try harder? The silence itself becomes punishment. This tactic is incredibly powerful because human beings are emotionally wired to seek resolution. Uncertainty creates psychological tension. The narcissist understands that unanswered emotional distance often hurts more deeply than direct conflict because the mind begins filling empty spaces with fear and self-blame. In many cases, the victim becomes desperate to restore connection. They apologize for things they did not do, they minimize their own feelings, they chase emotional reassurance, and the narcissist quietly watches as the balance of power shifts further in their favor. Then comes confusion, perhaps the most dangerous weapon of all. Confusion destroys clarity. Without clarity, emotional control becomes easy. The narcissist may praise you one day and criticize you the next. They may promise commitment while behaving inconsistently. They may deny words they clearly said. They may accuse you of being overly sensitive whenever you express pain. They may rewrite events, distort conversations, or twist reality so subtly that you begin doubting your own memory. This psychological manipulation is deeply destabilizing because the human mind depends on consistency to feel emotionally safe. When reality itself begins shifting unpredictably, anxiety increases. The victim spends enormous emotional energy trying to understand what is happening instead of recognizing the manipulation itself. Confusion also keeps people emotionally attached. A clear relationship is easier to leave. But confusion creates emotional paralysis. You constantly search for answers, explanations, closure, or certainty. You replay conversations repeatedly. You analyze behavior endlessly. You try to solve the relationship like a puzzle, believing that if you can just understand the problem, peace will finally return. Meanwhile, the narcissist remains in control because your emotional focus stays trapped inside their psychological maze. What makes these weapons especially dangerous is that they often work together simultaneously. The narcissist creates silence. The silence creates confusion. The confusion creates guilt. The guilt weakens your boundaries, and weakened boundaries restore the narcissist's emotional influence. This cycle can continue for years without the victim fully recognizing what is happening. Many strong, intelligent, emotionally mature people become trapped not because they are weak, but because these tactics attack human psychology at a very deep level. The narcissist does not always overpower people directly. Instead, they slowly train people to overpower themselves emotionally through self-doubt, anxiety, guilt, and constant emotional instability. And the longer this cycle continues, the more disconnected the victim becomes from their own inner voice, until they begin trusting the narcissist's version of reality more than their own feelings, instincts, memories, and emotional truth. One of the greatest misunderstandings about emotionally strong people is the belief that strength automatically protects them from manipulation. In reality, strong people are often deeply vulnerable in relationships, not because they lack intelligence, but because they possess qualities that narcissists know how to exploit beautifully. Compassion, patience, loyalty, empathy, emotional depth, and the willingness to see good in others can become dangerous when placed in the hands of someone who understands emotions but does not honor them sincerely. Strong people do not usually enter relationships looking for control. They enter looking for meaning, connection, honesty, and emotional intimacy. They believe love should involve effort, understanding, forgiveness, and growth. Because of this mindset, they often tolerate unhealthy behavior far longer than expected. They convince themselves that every difficult phase can be healed through communication, compassion, or patience. And narcissists recognize this almost immediately. At the beginning, manipulation rarely feels toxic. It feels intoxicating. The narcissist often creates an emotional experience so intense that it bypasses logic completely. The attention feels extraordinary. The connection feels rare. The compliments feel deeply personal. The emotional closeness develops rapidly, creating the illusion that you have finally found someone who truly understands your soul. For emotionally strong people who have spent years carrying responsibilities, hiding pain, or surviving emotional loneliness quietly, this sudden intensity can feel overwhelming in the most beautiful way. The narcissist studies them carefully and reflects back exactly what they long to receive emotionally. This is why manipulation is often mistaken for love in the early stages. The narcissist may call constantly, message endlessly, speak about the future quickly, and create a sense of emotional destiny around the relationship. They make you feel chosen, important, irreplaceable. And because strong people rarely allow themselves to be emotionally vulnerable easily, this intense attention breaks through walls they spent years building carefully. But love and emotional intoxication are not always the same thing. Healthy love develops with consistency, trust, honesty, and emotional safety over time. Manipulation often develops through emotional acceleration. The narcissist creates emotional dependency before true trust has even been established. Everything feels urgent, intense, magnetic, and emotionally consuming. Strong people often mistake this intensity for depth. Why? Because emotionally strong individuals usually love deeply themselves. When they commit emotionally, they do so sincerely, so they assume others experience emotions with the same honesty they do. They project their own integrity onto the narcissist. They believe the affection must be genuine because their own feelings are genuine. And this becomes the opening through which manipulation enters. When the narcissist eventually begins changing, becoming distant, critical, controlling, inconsistent, or emotionally cold, the strong person does not immediately recognize manipulation. Instead, they search for explanations rooted in empathy. They think perhaps the narcissist is stressed, wounded, insecure, traumatized, or afraid of intimacy. Strong people are problem solvers emotionally. They want to heal what hurts. They want to understand pain instead of abandoning people during difficult moments. And while this is a beautiful quality in healthy relationships, narcissists often weaponize it. The stronger your empathy becomes, the more likely you are to excuse behavior that should never have been normalized. You begin separating the narcissist into two different people in your mind: the loving version and the hurtful version. You become emotionally attached to the loving version while constantly trying to rescue it from the destructive one. Every small moment of affection renews hope. Every apology feels meaningful. Every temporary improvement convinces you that the relationship can still become what it once seemed to promise. And slowly, love becomes mixed with emotional survival. The strong person begins working harder for smaller amounts of affection. They start measuring relationships through potential instead of reality. They focus more on memories than patterns. And because they are emotionally resilient, they tolerate pain longer than most people would. This resilience becomes dangerous. Weak people often leave toxic relationships quickly because the emotional instability overwhelms them immediately. Strong people endure, they adapt, they rationalize, they carry emotional burdens silently. They believe loyalty means staying during difficult seasons. Narcissists take advantage of this endurance and slowly redefine suffering as proof of love. The manipulation becomes even more powerful because it is rarely constant. If the narcissist were cruel every single day, clarity would come faster. Instead, they alternate between affection and emotional punishment. This unpredictability creates emotional addiction. The strong person keeps waiting for the return of the loving version they experienced in the beginning. And because emotionally strong people are used to overcoming challenges in life, they often approach the relationship like another obstacle that can eventually be solved through effort, patience, sacrifice, and understanding. But manipulation is not healed through greater love from the victim. The painful truth many strong people eventually discover is that they were not loved for who they were fully. They were loved for what they provided emotionally: attention, validation, stability, admiration, forgiveness, emotional labor, and unconditional availability. And once the narcissist sensed that those emotional resources might disappear, the relationship often transformed into a psychological battle to regain control rather than a genuine effort to build healthy intimacy. One of the deepest fears people carry after surviving a narcissistic relationship is the fear of becoming emotionally hardened forever. After experiencing manipulation, betrayal, confusion, and emotional exhaustion, many people begin asking themselves painful questions. Will I ever trust again? Will I always feel guarded? Do I need to become cold in order to protect myself? These questions emerge because toxic relationships often create the illusion that kindness is weakness and emotional openness is dangerous. But protecting your peace does not require destroying your softness. This is one of the most important truths emotionally wounded people must understand. You do not heal by becoming cruel like those who hurt you. You do not recover by shutting down your heart completely, and you do not regain power by abandoning empathy, love, or emotional depth. True healing happens when you learn how to keep your compassion while finally placing boundaries around it. Many people confuse boundaries with emotional distance. They believe protecting themselves means becoming detached, suspicious, or emotionally unavailable. But healthy boundaries are not walls built to keep humanity away. They are doors with wisdom. They allow love to enter without allowing destruction to take permanent residence inside your life. Narcissistic relationships often train people to ignore their own instincts. Over time, victims stop listening to discomfort because they become conditioned to prioritize someone else's emotions above their own inner truth. They explain away red flags. They silence their intuition. They tolerate disrespect repeatedly because they hope understanding and patience will eventually create safety. Healing begins when you start trusting your inner voice again. Peace is not created by controlling other people. Peace is created by refusing to betray yourself emotionally anymore. This means learning to recognize behavior instead of becoming hypnotized by words. Narcissists often survive through promises, emotional performances, temporary changes, and carefully chosen language. But emotionally healthy people learn something powerful. Consistency reveals character more honestly than emotional intensity ever will. Someone who respects you consistently is safer than someone who loves you dramatically one day and destroys your peace the next. Protecting your peace also means accepting uncomfortable truths without constantly trying to rewrite them into something softer. Many wounded people remain trapped emotionally because they keep falling in love with potential instead of reality. They focus on who the narcissist could become instead of honestly facing who they repeatedly choose to be. This acceptance is painful because it requires grieving illusions. You grieve the future you imagined. You grieve the version of the relationship you hoped would exist. You grieve the person you believed they were in the beginning. And perhaps most painfully, you grieve the years spent abandoning yourself while trying to save someone who never truly wanted healing. But grief is healthier than denial because grief eventually leads toward clarity. Bitterness, however, is born when pain remains unprocessed. People become bitter when they carry unresolved betrayal inside them for too long. They begin seeing danger in everyone. They close themselves emotionally. They treat vulnerability as weakness. And while this may feel protective temporarily, it slowly transforms emotional survival into emotional isolation. True peace requires a different kind of strength. It requires the ability to say, "What happened hurt me deeply, but I will not allow that pain to poison my ability to love, trust wisely, or experience life fully." This is not naive optimism. It is emotional maturity. Emotionally mature people understand that boundaries and kindness can coexist. You can be compassionate without tolerating disrespect. You can forgive without reopening doors that destroyed your peace. You can love deeply while still walking away from unhealthy behavior. You can care about someone and still recognize they are unsafe for your emotional well-being. Protecting your peace also means becoming comfortable with disappointing people who benefited from your lack of boundaries. Narcissists often react strongly when access to your energy changes. They may call you selfish, cold, arrogant, dramatic, or unforgiving simply because you stopped tolerating behavior that once exhausted you emotionally. But healing people eventually realize something life-changing. Not everyone who becomes upset by your boundaries is being harmed by them. Some people are simply losing the control they once had over you, and this realization changes everything internally. You stop explaining yourself endlessly. You stop trying to convince unhealthy people to understand your pain. You stop negotiating your worth with those committed to misunderstanding you. You stop sacrificing your mental peace just to maintain artificial harmony. Instead, you begin building a quieter life emotionally, a life where peace matters more than emotional chaos disguised as passion, a life where your nervous system no longer lives in survival mode, constantly waiting for criticism, silence, manipulation, or emotional unpredictability. And slowly, something beautiful begins happening. Your heart softens again, but this time with wisdom attached to it. Your empathy remains alive, but it no longer overrides your self-respect. Your love becomes calmer, healthier, and less desperate for validation. You stop confusing emotional suffering with emotional depth. You stop chasing people who only value you when they can control you. And for the first time in a very long time, you begin experiencing the kind of peace that does not require you to abandon yourself in order to keep someone else comfortable.